The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common a path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is The Mockingbird Gospel.
Good evening, everyone. It's Wade Franson, and we're back for episode number 189 of Created in the Image of God. I have a wonderful guest in the studio tonight, somebody that I met a few weeks ago, and we've talked a little bit about doing the show tonight. He is he's been working with, I can't remember now if he's the founder. I think he's the founder, but he's certainly been very involved in something called Mockingbird Ministries, the Mockingbird Gospel. He has spent years bringing theology down to earth and translating it into language that is accessible. He's written a number of books. He's got one out now called The Big Relief, which we will learn about, as well as his unique approach to grace and making sure that it's done with a little dash of humor and a little dash of pop culture so that it's very accessible and available for today's audience. Welcome to the studio, David.
Hi, Wade. It's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So clarify my mangled intro there about your relationship to Mockingbird Ministries and the Mockingbird Gospel.
Sure. Mockingbird is an organization that I did help found, or was founded with some friends about 18 years ago, and it was founded in New York City, and it's since blossomed far beyond that. But the Mockingbird Gospel is that's not like a technical term, but I think sometimes people associate our organization with a form of a version of Christianity that really centers the grace of God in hopefully a trenchant but also playful and accessible way on all the things you said.
And these friends, these co-founders, were they in the same denominational context? Were they a diverse group of friends? Were they college buddies? Who were they? And what was your sort of thinking around the founding of this?
Well, we were I was working as a youth minister at the time in a parachurch organization that worked in independent schools and prep schools in New England, and so a few of them were friends from that work. But then also, I'm an Episcopalian, grew up in that denomination. I mean, spent time in many other denominations, but most of the original founding of Mockingbird was a bunch of sort of youthful, probably naive Episcopalians who were tired of kind of culture wars and denominational politics and wanted to get out there and use the internet to do something creative and really grace focused. So it quickly spread beyond that. We're certainly not affiliated with any specific tradition, and we have people who write for us and speak for us that are coming from all sorts of different backgrounds at this point. But that's where we began.
Well, let's go back a little bit further in time then. That's maybe a good segue. Your origin story, created in the image of God. We're all unique. How were you created? Who were your parents? What were the circumstances of your surrounding? What was little David like when he was running around as a toddler and growing up? And what forces formed and shaped you before you took conscious thought to become who you are today?
Well, gosh, that's such a wonderful question, and people don't ask it. It's precisely those with those parameters, which are so expansive and wonderful. I was born in the late 70s, 79, in New York City, downtown Manhattan, which was a very kind of a grisly place at that point. It was post-Vietnam New York City, where it was not the New York City that people associate with today. That's kind of a big shopping mall. My father was he had been raised in Christian Science, and my mother had been raised Methodist, and they had um, both had kind of radical conversions in their early 20s. And my father had actually gone into the ministry. So he was working as an Episcopal minister in Manhattan. But she's from the South, he's from the Mid-Atlantic. He's actually more of a Yankee, grew up in New York City himself. She's from Central Florida. Um, and so I like to think that I'm the product of these two very different people. It is an opposites attract situation. They're still very happily married, over 50 years later. Um, but so what was I like? We moved out of the Manhattan, out of downtown New York, when I was about 3 years old. My father's imagination probably shaped our childhood. I had a very stable and nurturing mother, and a father who was quite uh, quite intellectual, eccentric, loved movies, loved music, was always going to concerts and things like that, but was a very devout Christian person. So as I look back, I realize it was quite a strange brew that I was coming out of, because a lot of times people who are born in sort of more devout situations are cordoned off from the culture, and they never get to read certain books or listen to certain records. But that wasn't my childhood at all. But so anyway, we moved out to the suburbs. I was a sensitive kid. I think I was a middle child of three boys. I look back and think that I sort of felt like I carried the weight of the world on my shoulders. I had a very rambunctious older brother and a more introverted younger brother, and so I probably took on the mantle of the achiever, which has filtered its way into my work. Um, but yeah, a sensitive kid. I was always told I was pretty hard on myself, but I had a lot of friends. Humor has always been very important to me. Um, well-rounded was the phrase that got tossed in my direction a lot, but I think I always wanted to be just good at one thing, but I was always told I was well-rounded, which meant you're pretty good at a lot of things, but not really good at anything. But anyway, we moved around quite a bit because we moved to South Carolina, so I was in the tri-state area around New York City for until I was about 8 or 9. Moved to South Carolina for a little bit. Then we went to Europe, and so I went to German speaking school for a couple of years.
Wow.
Uh,
I got to pause you there because the questions are racking up, and I know I'm going to forget to dig in. So one of the first ones is, so your humor touch points, when you mentioned, you enjoyed humor, I know what they were for me, right? But what were some of the touch points in the area of humor that you remember just really igniting that spark where you realize this is really funny and laughing your head off kind of thing?
the earliest would have to be the Muppets. I think
Okay.
I felt that there was something that just it touched the heart, but really made me laugh, and that was Sesame Street
The
was
Swedish Chef, was that one?
Swedish. The silliness of Gonzo and the absurdity and the occasional breaking of the fourth wall. I love that stuff.
Yeah.
When I got a little bit older, Calvin and Hobbes was running in the
Oh
newspapers,
man.
and that was
Yeah, that's
very
brilliant,
formative.
brilliant, brilliant. Yeah.
I would say that those were big, big deals for me. And then when I got a little bit older, Seinfeld has always been an abiding love of mine, and I could watch
Not that there's
clips
anything wrong with that.
until the cows come home. Exactly. That was more middle school and high school.
Yeah.
But I would say those would probably be the three main influences on my sense of humor.
Well, very cool. The other thing is, what were the cause of those moves? Down to
Uh,
North Carolina and then to Europe.
well, I think my father was a fairly restless individual. It was common in our denomination at that point, less so now, that you would spend, you have a tenure of about 5 to 7 years in various places. His was a little shorter than that, and he decided he wanted to go get his graduate degree, a PhD in Germany when we were in seventh
Was that
grade.
in
When
Tübingen by any chance, or where did he get that?
bingo, yes, it was in Tübingen. That's exactly where it was. So
Yeah,
I
because
got,
I lived in Stuttgart for 5 years. I was
Oh,
pastoring
really?
a three-church circuit in Stuttgart, Basel, and Zurich for
Well,
our
we lived
small
in Zurich
denomination.
for 1 year while he was in Tübingen and then moved to Tübingen, and which was, for a 14-year-old kid, uh, which is what I was at the time, although I was yanked out of prep school in South Carolina, which is a very different scene than, 8th grade and gymnasium in Tübingen. Um, it was a wonderful place because you could be everywhere. You could ride a if you could ride a bike, it was basically like having a car,
Yeah,
and, it's medieval, kind of Legoland almost. It was a wonderful
yeah,
place to be for a couple years.
yeah. So you still speak some German, or?
I do, I do. I studied German in college, and it ended up going and living in Vienna for a
Oh, wow.
year. So, but we were moving around quite a bit, so they sent me to boarding school in Connecticut. So I was educated at a boarding school for 3 years, and then ended up going to college. I would say that faith-wise, I wasn't very interested in church or really even Jesus, from about age 13 to probably 23. I wasn't
Hmm.
antagonistic because I loved my parents and didn't see them as foolish or misguided. Uh, eh, I needed to figure out who I was. And, come to find out that included a sincere faith in God and God's grace and the
So what
person
was
work
the
of
when
Jesus.
did, as the Germans say, when did the penny drop, right? I mean, y I'm debating here whether I should launch into German with you, but I'm looking at the audience and I'm not seeing anyone saying go for it. So, anyway, so, yeah, what was the turning point that that made you, think more seriously about faith and getting involved in religion and Jesus and
The first thing that happened was when I said I was in Austria for a year by myself, direct matriculation. Uh, I got very quite lonely, but also, I mean, I eventually made friends, but it was just, plopped into the enormous university system there. And I took a class on the Bible, on the Synoptic Gospels. So I actually read the Bible first in German, um, the Luther
ausgezeichnet.
translation. Danke.
I mean, I
Yeah.
used to give sermons in German, obviously, when I was doing that church circuit. So it's been a while, but
Oh my
yeah,
goodness.
yeah.
Well, so I actually read the Bible for the first time. I mean, I grew up Episcopalian, which is,
The Luther Bible, I assume.
yes, the Luther Bible. Um, and I was transfixed by it. I don't think nothing can really prepare you for that. So that was really important for me. But then, I think that it's got to travel from the head to the heart. And the year after I graduated from college, I went through some personal difficulties, basically the beginning and ending of a relationship, a romantic relationship that left me pretty bereft and also exposed kind of who, I was all of a sudden doing things I wasn't super proud of and getting to know myself in a new way. And at that point, when I was in pain, I just started praying. And all of a sudden, before I knew it, I was part of a Bible study with some really wonderful folks who supported me during that time in a way that other people really didn't know what to do with that crisis time. And then before I knew it, I was working as a youth minister. It wasn't something I really sought out. I felt almost I was delivered into. And then had a very steep learning curve of what on earth am I doing here? But as time went on, we talked about humor. I met, it was very important to me that I found some Christians who had a good sense of humor because my experience of Christians at high school and in college was that they took themselves extremely seriously
Yeah.
and were not very funny. So meeting some Christians who could really laugh and make me laugh was instrumental. So it's all sorts of things. You look back and um, you see that there was maybe more going on than you realized at the time. But those are the broad strokes.
Well, little anecdote from when I was in Stuttgart, there were a couple of brothers actually from Tübingen who joined our church, And we were actually not even a denomination. Actually, before I go into this little anecdote, the Episcopalian Church, because I recently learned that there are 40,000 denominations. I was shocked. I knew there were many, but 40,000 denominations? That was
Mm.
shocking. Okay, fact checkers, go make sure that's right. But that's what somebody told me, and I kind of don't doubt it. But the Episcopalian Church, where does that come from? What is it? Who are they?
Well, it's originally the Church of England. It's the Church of England in America is the Episcopal Church, originally called the Protestant Episcopal Church. Now there's such a thing as that, the Anglican Church and the Episcopal Church, but historically speaking, the Henry VIII wanted to get divorced, and he couldn't be Roman Catholic and do that, so he ran into this guy named Thomas Cranmer, who was extremely. He was not only a theologian, but a poet, and he could really write. So this was a man who had been truly convinced by Martin Luther's theology about justification by grace through faith, and the priesthood of all believers, and all of these wonderful things. And he Henry VIII sort of leaned on Cranmer to start this new church that was kind of, people sometimes characterize it as like a halfway house between Rome and Geneva, or between true Protestant it still has some ritual, but it's really just, when you say an Episcopal Church, it's usually just something that's governed by the Book of Common Prayer that Thomas Cranmer wrote. It's wildly varied in its expression, which is one thing I think is interesting about it.
Well,
But it
so
also
it's the same
means
as in England. It's the same as the Anglican Church, right? It's another name for it, the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And you mentioned getting into humor and grace because of the culture wars, right? So there was like a kind of a, I don't know, a split or a schism, I don't know, 20 years ago or so, was it? And I just talked to a pastor, or excuse me, a priest who we're going to have on the show here in a month or so, who's living in Norway, who said the Anglican Church just split this past week. Did you hear anything about that?
I know a little bit about it. I'm not ordained. I kind of
Okay.
intentionally not ordained.
Yeah.
There's a lot of splits always. If you're dealing with any Protestant denomination, the
Well, and
last
that's how
50
we get
years.
40,000 denominations, right? And then the reason for this particular split was the Archbishop of Canterbury is now a woman, and that was a bridge too far for some. And I guess that's never happened before. So that's, anyway, I'm not commenting on it.
Yes,
I'm just throwing that out there.
complicated because the Anglicans don't.
Yeah.
Uh, the uh, the 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 Anglicans don't the Archbishop as like a pope. So it's a strands of Anglicanism do. It's wildly convoluted when you get down to it. I don't want to minimize what the heartache that a lot of people feel around a lot of this stuff, but I find it easier to exist as just a Christian. Um, and my local church, which I happen to really love, is an Episcopal church. And but I feel at home in a Methodist church, a Presbyterian church. I've spent time in Pentecostal churches, and um, I went to a Catholic university. I feel like I've had some tours of different expressions of Christianity, and I think there's, without sounding glib, I think there's wonderful things. There's blind spots, but also really strong things about almost every expression.
Yeah, well, let me wrap up this opening segment then with this little anecdote. And part of the reason I threw that in there is just that people taking themselves too seriously, right? I resigned from the ministry when the denomination I was a part of, and again, it wasn't really a denomination because we didn't accept the Trinity, which made us heretics. So we didn't get to really call ourselves a denomination, if you will. We were kind of outside.
Mm.
But when our church split right down the middle over doctrinal differences and couldn't somehow keep it together, that's when I realized this thing about taking oneself too seriously. Though that was not how I put it at the time. But it was a serious matter that we were taking ourselves so seriously that we couldn't stay together. You follow me? That we couldn't
Oh,
work out
sure.
whatever differences there were. So I resigned in 1995 from that to separate my faith from my paycheck. But before that, when I was over in Germany, this was actually only like 3 or 4 years before that, before I returned to the US. Um, there were these two brothers who were studying theology in Tübingen who joined our church, our denomination, which was very different. We, for example, also did not believe in um, going out and trying to preach the gospel outside. We believed where Peter said, "Be ready always to give an answer to everyone who asks you." But we didn't feel it was our requirement to go out and profess Jesus to others, right? But these two brothers came from that, and this one brother told me that he used to get on the U-Bahn, the subway, and he would always be nervous when somebody said, and he'd break out into a sweat because he felt this obligation to preach Christ to the person who sat next to him. And
Hmm.
for him, it was a big relief to not have that burden because in Germany, largely Jesus, it's not a new thing that people haven't heard of. And you know what I mean? So if you imagine having to talk about Jesus to everyone who's sitting next to you on the U-Bahn every day, back and forth, I can imagine breaking out in a cold sweat. But Mockingbird and your approach maybe lightens that up a little bit. So we'll go now to the video, and when we get back into the segment, we're going to have you unpack what all that is, how you approach it differently, how you maybe overcome that burden or that nervousness that this brother in Tübingen had.
Is a pressure cooker. No matter who you are, everyone is searching for relief of some kind. We crave relief from the treadmill of professional and financial and relational demand that only seems to get faster every single year. We crave relief from guilt and from regret and from rejection and grief. What we ultimately need, though, is grace, the grace of God. Grace represents an alternative to all of that. It is relief to those who are weary and worn out. Grace is the big relief at the heart of the Christian faith.
I really like that video. I've watched it a couple times now, and every time I see all the different ways in which stress impacts us at the beginning. So I thought we'd start off this segment by inviting you to give your definition of grace as it maybe applies to this book or to life in an accessible way.
Sure. I think grace is one of these big words that can carry a lot of weight. And the book is an attempt to sort of wrap my arms around it without saying it is only this and not that, while also give it some substance. I think the classic definition of grace is it's a gift with no strings attached. That's the language of the Bible. Very often, Paul's words for grace is the same word as gift. I like the youth ministry version of unmerited favor. Unwarranted generosity is a good one. I really like a non-contingent compassionate alliance. That's a psychological definition of grace. I've heard people describe grace as one-way love. I think grace is a surprise, it's a surprising interruption in the sort of quid pro quo that usually defines our lives. So there's all sorts of ways, again, to talk about it. Those are a few that I find compelling.
Well, as you were describing those, the image that was coming to mind for me was heaven smiling on us.
Heaven smiling on us. Yeah, I mean that's that's beautiful. I mean that's really the theological definition is grace is the answer that the Bible gives us to God's disposition towards real people like you and me. So that's I think that and that disposition is not uh God is not mad at you. God is fundamentally gracious in the final in the end result in the last word is always the love of God, which trumps all the other messages we receive. The forgiveness. In the book I talk about grace as relief, and so I kind of catalog the pressures that we live under, which are many, especially different times in our lives, like the pressure to keep up, the pressure to always be growing, the pressure to always be producing, the pressure to, you know, uh, um, justify yourself, the pressure to save yourself and save the world. So I try to catalog those and talk about how different tributaries of grace are maybe are going to hit us at different times. So for someone who's filled with regret, forgiveness is going to feel like grace. To someone who's who's filled with anxiety about their status, well then the God's imputation of identity, his bestowing of sort of his child of that you were a child of God who's loved, that's going to really speak loudly. But if you're feel like you're a person who's captive or addicted, well then grace is gonna look like rescue very often, liberation. And so I go through all the various things that at least speak to my life as a person in desperate need of grace. I spoke earlier about how I've always had a very loud inner critic, always had a sort of a internalized a lot of pressure, even when it wasn't there, uh, or even when my parents tried to alleviate that. And so I'm desperate for the pardoning word, the room to breathe that we hear about in the grace of God.
Yeah, so I'm reflecting now on that young man who joined our congregation in Stuttgart, and um, instead of feeling a burden and a pressure, um, just to embrace the person who sat next to you, and to I think I've certainly gotten more like that over the years.
Mm.
Um, Even I'm reflecting even on how we do this show, to just welcome whoever it is, wherever they're coming from. And I'm reflecting on those different aspects that you were describing from your book, and how God's grace will look different to different people depending on what the stress is, what the pressure is, what the problem is, what the challenges that they in particular are dealing with.
Uh, I think that's true. I mean, if you're talking to someone who's in prison for a crime they committed, well, then talking to them about, atonement, that God atones for guilt, like that there's courtroom metaphors that really are the Bible's filled with them. Like that's going to have deep resonance. However, if you're more a person who is, I guess, just weighed down by debt, well, then again, forgiveness is going to be something that is going to you're going to your heart is going to leap at that. And it's not like we're always one or the other. I think that grace meets us at different times in our life and looks and feels different. If you're someone who's lonely and rejected, well, then God's grace is going to feel like welcome and inclusion and embrace. There's no question about that. Oftentimes, I think, I mean, I like to talk about the gospel. I'm not shy about preaching, but I do know that if it's kind of uninvited or it can be aggressive, and what people don't, they don't actually hear, "Hey, God loves you." What they hear is, um, "I want to change you." So, and that's actually received as judgment, not as grace. Um, and so you have to do, I think the challenge always when you're talking about this extremely potent thing known as the grace of God is that the delivery method has to match or at least be somewhat in sync with the content of what you're trying to convey. So if you're being overbearing and pushy about forgiveness, someone is not going to, it's not going to compute. The circuits are not going to match up. It's just going to feel aggressive and like an attack. So I think there are ways, and honestly, my books have all been an attempt, and everything we've done with Mockingbird has been an attempt to not just talk about the grace of God, but to do so in a gracious manner that is full of humor, full of play, does not ignore the dark side of human nature or of our own lives, takes seriously human pain, but also takes seriously God in such a way, in God's forgiving love, in such a way that people feel addressed rather than condescended to or patronized. So
Yeah, in terms of
we don't
how,
always do it right. Right.
right, we need a little grace around how we do this gracefully. But one of the things that I'm thinking of are a couple of analogies. One is that religion must inspire, not coerce. That's kind of something I've come to in terms of what is religion, how should it be practiced, how should it be applied. The other one is simply, we are the light of the world, not the loudspeaker. And when you just kind of contrast those two modes of operation, you think about the difference, right? What's the difference between a light and a loudspeaker, right?
I love that. It's true. I mean, I think God speaks. I think that there's the word is the word.
Of course.
I think
But
if we're
but
quiet
we're
enough
we're
to
supposed to be a
listen,
light, you know.
but we're supposed to be a light. Exactly. And that's not always the case. And I'm drawn to lightness. I'm drawn to lightness in terms of weightiness, and I'm also drawn to light in terms of the world can feel like a pretty dark place, and my internal life can feel like a pretty dark place sometimes. I'm dying to get closer to the light.
Yeah, another one is, I was reflecting recently, and I think I might have talked about this on an episode here recently. I actually spent a lot of time in the book of Genesis. I love it. It just seems to keep giving and giving. And I was focusing on this question that God asked Adam and Eve, who told you you were naked? Right. And now that can seem like an accusation, but it's actually kind of funny because it's like, I created you naked. They were naked. They were naked when God created them. Who
Yeah.
told you you were naked? What does that mean? Does it mean who let the cat out of the bag? You didn't realize you were naked? It's much more subtle than that, right? You got to unpack that. Who introduced shame into the beauty that I created? Because when he created us, he said it was very good. Everything else he created was good, right? The light was good, the sea was good. At the end of the day, it was good. And when he created us, it was very good, right?
Hmm.
And so who told you were naked? You know what I mean? Where did that shame come from? Where did suddenly heaven smiling on you turn into heaven is scowling at you?
I know. Shame is the first product of the fall. I mean, at least traditionally speaking, it's right there accompanying the lie. It's a deeply tragic reality that sort of goes all the way back to the beginning, but it seems to be what is offending our creator at that point is, wait a
Well, but
second,
see, even that, right?
who
So let's talk about this for a moment based on the scripture, because this is something I came to, I don't know, maybe 7, 8 years ago. Because I've always spent a lot of time in Genesis, and that was really critical to our foundation. We didn't believe in original sin per se, as it's
mm,
classically defined in theology. We didn't use the term the fall, but
mm,
we did believe that that was the time when we all went astray, right? And so I realized later that Paul says, talking to the Corinthian church, which is another, not good example. If you can't be a good example, maybe you can serve as a horrifying warning. And the Corinthian church did, right? So throughout history, the horrifying warning, you have need that somebody teach you again the basics. You're still drinking milk. you should be eating strong meat by this time. Strong meat, what is that? It belongs to those who by reason of use have exercised their senses to discern good and evil. That's what Paul says, which immediately, if you think about it, takes you back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Paul is really saying a mature Christian is eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but he's processing it differently. She's processing it differently, right? Discerning, using the senses to discern good and evil. The issue with the tree was prematurely, immaturely, taking it the wrong way, coming to the wrong conclusions, influenced by negative doubt, right? The serpent casting doubt on what it is that God's doing, what he stands for. Is he really good? He seems like he's trying to keep something from you. He doesn't want you to become like him, right? How stupid is that? You know, we're created in God's image. Oh, God knows in the day you eat of that fruit, you're going to become like him, and he doesn't want that. You know, knowing good and evil. And Paul says, no, God wants you to know good and evil. He wants you to come to your own understanding, your own discernment of it. So I view the creation story, the Garden of Eden story, very differently today. It's simply an explanation of the emergence of consciousness, the emergence of freedom, the emergence of independence, the fact that God gives us autonomy. He says he will, you know, he will send rain on the just and the unjust alike. Grace is available to all, and all will eventually come back to understand that God is good, and will come to an understanding of the difference between good and evil through a million different paths in the light, right? If we have lights that can be an example and guide people towards it. So I don't even think about that story as the fall anymore. It's more like, okay, now the kid's going to be running around in dirty diapers for a while, you know, until it grows up. And that's what we did as a species.
Yeah.
You know, there's a maturing that comes individually and as a species throughout all of the revelation of God through, you know, Adam, Noah, Moses, Abraham, Jesus. This constant education.
I certainly love the God seeking after those who are hiding in shame. I think that there's that story of the rest of the Bible seems to be God's refusal to give up on these wayward, however you want to put it. I'm not. I always think of the fall is probably, and that's just a shorthand for me. But I would say that it's more of like a reaching up, and then a believing something. Unbelief is probably how some Protestants would talk about it. The doubt that you're saying, like I don't actually believe what I was told, and but
because
what I focus on there is
again
always
in Hebrews, you know, the faith chapter, it is those who would come to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And it's that doubt that somehow God doesn't have our best interest at heart that allows that sort of worm of self-doubt and shame and fear to enter in.
I think Martin Luther said that the root unbelief is the root of all sin, and I think that's probably part of what he was getting at, this failure to, or at least resistance to, taking God at his word. That there's something, but I mean, I happen to have a sober view of myself, at least, and that I know I have a resistance oftentimes. I want things my way on my terms, and I don't. I wish it were as easy as me knowing what the right thing was, or the right thing to believe was, and then I could just do it. But there's some kind of internal rebellion that needs to be reckoned with. So, I mean, this is where I actually think grace comes in. However you want to frame it, you've God not leaving us to our own devices, not leaving us to the lies that we adopt, that we take on board, and you have this pursuit, this sort of passionate, sacrificial pursuit of the dirty diapered child, which I find to be tremendously comforting, because in my own life I often I don't find it to be a linear progression ever. I find that I do some things better, I believe, in some ways more, but then new things are always being uncovered, where I still need God's intervention and power and grace to
So,
bring me
so,
to that light.
so part of the work then of Mockingbird in your books, is it to sort of coax that person out a little bit, out of that resistance, maybe out of that rebellion, to help them make it easier to take a first step? Or what is it that you're kind of trying to achieve there with the approach that you take?
Well, I'm trying to make it, first of all, why would any of these Christian ideas, stories, scriptures, why would they be of interest in the first place? Sometimes I think that we just expect people to be interested in the Bible because it's the Bible, but they're not.
Right.
I mean, I'm trying to demonstrate the need and the experience we're already having of our own inadequacies, our own shame, our own fear, our own guilt, our own inability to treat others the way that we would like to be treated. I think that I'm trying to surface these things, not necessarily in a condemnatory way, but to name them, and then to translate or use fresh language for the beautiful message about who God is in Jesus. Um, and so each of my books tries to take a different sort of pile of Christian resources and sort of maybe dust it off for the sake of contemporary traction in contemporary people's lives. So when I wrote this, Seculosity is a book I wrote back in 2019, and I was sort of talking about replacement religion and how people aren't actually any less religious than they used to be. They're just religious about different things. They're religious about politics. They're religious about exercise. They're religious about food. They're religious about romance. And that is burning us out because there's no mercy in any of those replacement religions. There's no grace. But that was really ultimately a Trojan horse for me to translate the doctrine of justification by faith into contemporary language, which sounds like this antiquated, boring, irrelevant thing. Justification by grace through faith. What is that? Well, it's this idea that your enoughness, which you're tirelessly pursuing in every avenue of your life, is actually a gift of God, like from God to you. There is, I think, a deep relief in the accepting what is already, instead of trying to earn what can't be, trying to pay for what is freely given. So, and then Low Anthropology, I tried to take a view of human creatureliness and limitation and sin, and try to bring that into a why would someone ever even want to believe this? Well, my experience is that love is usually found at the point of weakness, not at the point of success. Like that, the greatest unity I feel with other people is because we share our, we've suffered together, we've failed together. I know your what hurts you, your wounds, not just what you're proud of. And so I tried to, that was talking about contemporary divisions and how we're divided by all sorts of things we aspire to, but we're united in our shared failure to achieve those aspirations on our own steam. And then the big relief, of course, is just me trying to get at the grace of God, which is counterintuitive. It exists in relief against the way that life tends to work, which is usually some sort of transactional, I do this for you, you do that for me. Um,
Right.
and so relief is this word that I just kept hearing everywhere I go, from people talking about, disaster relief after hurricanes, to people talking about, canceling their Netflix account because they can't keep up with the shows. It's just, I got the sense, oh, gosh, if you really listen to your neighbors, listen to your own heart, people are just crying out for relief. And life seems to be getting faster every year. More is being asked of us professionally, relationally, financially, etc. Where is hope to be found? Is God just another treadmill? Is religion just another ladder to fail at? And I don't think so. So I was trying to reclaim some of this stuff with compassion and including myself in the diagnosis, but also to do it, Wade, with some playfulness, because this is not about like solving a problem or getting something right. It's about disclosing and exposing what life actually feels like today. And in light of that, how might Jesus be of interest? And what is it about his message in person that endures? What is it about the Holy Spirit that would be of tremendous urgent importance for folks? Um, whether I do it successfully or not, I don't know, but that's what I've tried to do, because there's a lot of books out there written for Christians. There's a lot of books out there uh, that are helping those who are growing in their faith in all sorts of ways. But in my own ministry and work in Central Virginia, I didn't feel like I had a lot of resources to give to people who were sort of curious, but not quite there emotionally, or they needed some coaching with the plausibility structures. It's a lot
Well,
of things I just said.
no, it's awesome, and I'm just drinking it in. I really love your approach. I love I'm just reflecting and thinking about everything you're saying. We're going to go to a really quick commercial break, and when we come back, we're going to ask the question: where are you growing next? How has all this been working, and what is the feedback, and what's next on the horizon for you, for Mockingbird, for your writing? Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of David and the grace of relief.
What if everything you thought about healing was missing one vital piece? 7 generations of doctors, one man who took a different path. Betty Carmichael never went to med school, but he discovered something that science can't always explain: a spiritual process with the power to heal. Inside one of the nation's toughest recovery centers, he tested a 3-step spiritual method to address the real root of suffering, what he calls the prayer of freedom. An unexpected result happened. Nearly 90% of participants walked away healed in under a week. Now he's sharing this powerful process with the world, one that works regardless of religion or belief. Discover the prayer of freedom and unlock the life you were meant to live.
Welcome back to Creating in the Image of God. I'm here with, and I got to look up your name to make sure I pronounce it right, David Zahl, who co-founded Mockingbird and has a new book out called The Big Relief. So we've been talking a lot about your approach to grace, David, and making it accessible. So what's next for you? I know you're currently traveling the nation. The book's getting great reviews. I was looking at some of them on Amazon, and it's like way over 4.5 stars. Is like one lower review, but the person didn't actually leave a review. We think they probably thought the book was great and got the numbers reversed. But anyway, so what's next? What's on the horizon? Where are you growing next?
Well, this is the big question. I've got a lot of different projects I'm thinking about moving into. There's a chapter in the book about play as the relief from productivity. This feeling that, I have to produce. I live every day having to. If something's not productive, it's not worth doing. And play is sort of the form that grace often takes, which is play is something you do because you delight in it and you enjoy it for its own sake. And I think play is a mode of being in the world that grace makes possible. And I've just written a long article about it that'll come out in Christianity Today, I think in about a month. But I've thought about possibly expanding that into a book, into a short book, because I think that this play is usually also synonymous with freedom. And I think there's something deeply, the great question of the Christian life is sort of, what will you do now that you don't have to do anything? And so I want to play is something I want to explore how it works as a church and as a creative person, as a writer, as a man. I think men in middle age stop playing unless they're playing golf. So I want to explore that. That's one thing. I'm also very interested in loneliness and in middle age among men and women, but how do I weave that into the other? I mean, I'm very interested in perfectionism, the addiction of revenge that sort of seems to be afflicting our society. So I'm not exactly sure. The play thing feels like the strongest and most constructive. Um, I don't want it to sound flaky, but I think it could be generative um, as a project to go about playfully. Because certainly I have three boys. I need that reminder. We talked about Calvin and Hobbes earlier, and and
Yeah.
the Muppets. These things all. I think the world is such a heavy place right now that almost like a Christian act of resistance is almost to play and to
Well,
um,
no, I love
make.
that idea. And I don't think I shared this with you, but I was diagnosed many years ago with a chronic crippling disease. And this was all during that time when I resigned from the industry. The reason I actually moved back from Europe to the US was on temporary disability. And I was then offered permanent disability. And I was told by doctors in multiple countries I would be in a wheelchair at age 40. And one of the things I was doing, and I turned the disability down because I said I'm going to beat this thing, which may have been stupid and may have been arrogant. But thankfully, the church I was part of made it possible for me to have time off and to do what I could to get well. There was no cure, there was no treatment. But one of the things that I was doing was swimming. I was staying on the campus where I had gone to college while during this period of recovery, and they had a big Olympic swimming pool for the college there, and I would go swim every morning. And this was before Michael Phelps made cupping popular. The big blue purple welts on your back. I was doing that for healing, not for swimming, and to oxygenate my back. And so I looked like, and nobody'd ever seen that. So I looked like the victim of a giant squid attack, right? When I would get in the pool, everybody else would get out, which was fine for me because it allowed me to swim my laps. But I was trying to measure progress in my hope of getting better against the clock. And I was always a swimmer in college. And before that, swimming was always a thing with me. So I would swim a mile, and I would see if my time was getting better. And my time would get better for like 3, 4, 5 days, and then I'd have a relapse, and I could barely move. You follow me? And something told me that this was part of the problem. So instead of looking at the clock and the time, I said, I'm just going to focus on my stroke. And I'm going to pretend that I'm dancing, which I couldn't dance to save my life. I've never danced, but I'm like, just the feel of gliding through the water and doing it in such a way that, if you do it right, it's like being a dolphin or something. You know what I mean? It's playful.
Mm.
And there are all these different things. I did so many things to eventually experience healing, and I believe God guided it. We had that ad about healing. I believe there's a power in getting alignment with God, however you do that, right? And God will help you become well, right? But it was that idea of changing the way that I thought, changing the way that I approached things. Again, the big relief. Going swimming gracefully would have been another way to say it, right? Swimming under the grace of God, rather than trying to accomplish something or compete or get better. Just enjoy. Just enjoy it.
You're speaking my language, Wade. I was a swimmer in college myself, and what prevents me usually from getting back in the pool these days is that need to measure and to be so cognizant of where I used to be, and the exercises that I enjoy now they're not. I have to. They're much more playful, and they have to be somewhat fun, and I couldn't. That's great confirmation. I remember I swam in Tübingen too, so
Oh, wow. Yeah, when I moved to Germany, I joined the water polo team in Bonn, and there were all these like 6'4" guys, and I'm pretty short. Man, that was brutal, right? Our warm up was swimming a mile. Water polo is the most brutal sport on earth.
Yeah, I'm a water polo player too. I played at boarding school. It was a huge part of my life, and very humbling, extremely humbling.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, that's confirmation. Maybe I should dive, pun intended, deeper into that pool.
Well, we're gonna quickly go to a couple of audience comments because you just reminded me way early on there was somebody who said, this when we were talking about humor. Did you ever read The Far Side?
No, love
Gary
the Far
Larson.
Side, of course. I
I'm,
think,
what's your favorite Far
yeah.
Side cartoon?
Oh my gosh, probably the Midvale School for the Gifted. I just, where that's
Push,
how
don't
could
pull. Yeah.
push don't pull. I mean, that's so emblematic. But all the ones of God, in his laboratory kitchen stuff. I like the absurdity of the Far Side though. Like I think
Yeah.
sometimes there's some stuff that doesn't really make any sense, but it's about cows, and you realize it's just absurd. I appreciate that
Yeah.
stuff.
I always loved the scientists in their lab coats that were acting like kindergartners.
Oh, I know. That's a great one too. I love it.
Yeah. So let's see what else we've got here. Well, we talked a little bit about denominations and whatnot. Again, very early on, Christian Science. How did that affect your childhood? This person heard wild things about that religion. So what was Christian Science? And you mentioned there was kind of a yin yang between your mom and dad as well.
I think, I mean, Christian Science is very much sort of the power of positive thinking. It's skeptical. It venerates Jesus, but not as God. But the way that my father pretty much walked away from rejected that wholeheartedly. But what he didn't reject was that we it was never his impulse to take us to the doctor when we were sick. Christian Science usually believes that sort of the most hardcore Christian scientists at least believe that sort of healing is all spiritual, and no medicine is needed. So we laugh that he rejected a lot of the theology, but this is a man who had terrible allergies but would never go to the doctor. And my mother's family is filled with doctors, so there was an interesting kind of push and pull there too. But
Yeah.
yeah.
So this one here, maybe more for me, my analogy, but I'll let you deal with it. Wasn't Jesus a loudspeaker?
I think so, but I think we are not Jesus. So I think that I want to amplify the words of Christ, and I want to allow him to speak where, rather than, I don't know of how much the world needs that much more of me, but yeah, I mean, but I don't think of Jesus as a billboard in that, or like kind of that kind of loudspeaker. Just, Jesus interacted with people. I mean, he wasn't, there was always a give and take. But there was more giving, but there was, I don't think I understand why, like, Christ is God's great revelation, God's great message to the world is enfleshed in Jesus Christ. I believe that, but I also think that how that actually works out in practice, he wasn't going around shouting at people. Like he would preach, but many, many times he would also interact.
Yeah, I would also, very well said. I would also add to that. I was thinking as you were talking, he spoke in parables. And then when they asked him, why do you speak in parables? He said, in fulfillment of Isaiah, seeing they will not see, hearing they will not hear. To them, it's not given. So he wasn't, in that sense, he wasn't a loudspeaker. He wasn't trying to overpower everybody. He wasn't trying to force them to accept or listen. He was more evoking curiosity and
Yes.
allowing people to come to their own conclusions about things.
Man, I just think if Christianity is just a matter of turning up the volume, that's pretty that is pretty oppressive. I don't think it is. I mean, I think it's much more about God meeting you sometimes with a still small voice in the worst moment of your life. And sometimes God can be loud. I mean, to get our attention, it's not easy all the time. But anyway, it's a
I
great
remember
question.
giving a sermon in the Black Forest to this conference, and I was chosen for Youth Day, right? Because I was younger back then. And so Youth Day was a hard thing in our church, right? Especially at a conference like that, because, we had these epic 90-minute sermons in our denomination and people didn't know how to reach the youth and the youth tuned out. And I gave a sermon on attention getting devices, which was a ploy for me to use a lot of attention getting devices throughout the sermon. But all the devices which God has used throughout history to get our attention, and there's just a huge different diversity of attention getting devices that God has used.
Wow. Well, we live in an attention economy, my friends.
Yeah. Well, here's one for you. What practices or rhythms help you stay grounded in grace when you're in a season of busyness or fatigue?
Well, for me, a lot of that revolves around church. I go to a church that I enjoy and I love, but I also it's a place where I get to serve other people. And I go there at least 3 times a month. I'm part of a men's Bible study on Wednesday, and I like to wake up when I have the chance to and journal and read and do the things. A prayer journal is really important to me. It hasn't always been, but right now in my life, it's become important. But the other, I also try to. It is important for me to take care of my body, get enough sleep, all those sorts of mundane things that sometimes I think I'm so spiritual and don't need, but I do. And but for me, I would say that going to a church where I not only hear about the grace of God, but I experience it from other people, but also through the liturgy. I know I can rely on that it's not people making it up as they go along, that there's but the Holy Spirit's not somehow checked at the door. I'm very grateful for that. I don't take it for granted because I know that that's not a lot of people's experience of church. But for me, it's become that Sunday. But every day, there's certain rhythms that I've tried to adopt. Of course, with little kids and all the pressures I describe in the book, the best laid plans of mice and men are sometimes just that.
Yeah.
But God is always drawing me back to those things.
So, somebody told me recently, if you want to hear God laugh, make a plan.
Yeah, I love that's a great joke or a
Because
great
he has other
truism.
plans. Right. So one more, because we're out of time here, but I'll throw this one out there and then I'll invite you to have the last word. What has surprised you the most about the way God has continued to work in your life or ministry? Something you didn't see coming when you first started the Mockingbird Project?
Gosh, well, I didn't see myself as a writer when we started the Mockingbird Project, and I've now written 4 books, and I've countless blog posts and articles, and I found out I love the written word, and I find it delightful. And I find there's playfulness in that process. But this is questions, a very sweet one because almost nothing that's happened in Mockingbird is according to what I envisioned, and it's much bigger and more interesting. If it had been just what I wanted, we would have reached some yuppie 20 somethings in New York City, and that would have been the sort of the end of the day. And it's been a more expansive and adventurous thing, and I've gotten to go to places I never thought I would, and watch some of our things be translated into different languages, and hear from folks in every conceivable context that they've been encouraged by the resources we've produced and the podcasts we host. And um, I hear from a lot of people that Mockingbird has really helped either save their faith or God has used it uh, to bring them comfort in a desperate season, and that to me is very exciting. But like none of us saw COVID coming, and that Mockingbird was ideally positioned to, so many churches thought, oh, online ministry online, or that doesn't sound like a thing. And then all of a sudden, the whole world was forced to do this stuff, and we were already there. We had our social media channels, we had our infrastructure. So that talk about a surprise, which I
Wow.
never would want, but that was great.
Yeah. Silver lining. So how people go, mockingbird.com, obviously the big relief, they can get it on Amazon. Do you have a way they can contact you or engage with what you're doing?
Yeah, mbird.com, mbird.com, or mockingbird.org. People can find us there. We have a conference coming up in Charlottesville, Virginia. We have in November. Every April we have a conference in New York City. But I host a podcast called The Mockingcast, and that's every 2 weeks. That's sort of talking about all sorts of cultural touch points with the grace of God. But my books are out there, and I'm not hard to find.
Wonderful. So, last words. What do you want to leave the audience with as we wrap up here? And after that, we've just got one thing, which is to air the sneak peek for next week.
Well, I just want to say that I'm seeing these comments, and I'm very someone it's got a screen name "Selling England by the Pound," which is just about my favorite record of all time by the band Genesis. So I just have to say that out loud. But what do I want to leave people with more seriously? I think that um, it's okay to trust in God, that God is gracious and not mean or capricious. So that's I mean I always like to tell people God's not mad at them, um, and that's something you can actually hang your hat on, um, and it's okay to laugh at yourself.
Amen. We have this sort of tagline at the end. Remember, you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation.
Well, what a better way, what better place to end than that.
Well, David, it's sure been a pleasure. I'm going to, check out Mockingbird, one of your podcasts, get involved a little bit because I'm really heartened by your approach. I love it. It's just a good feeling to know that we can have fun together with this. And maybe sometimes I do take things a little too seriously. My kids, if they were listening to this, they'd be like, "Yeah, Dad, you should listen to this guy." So,
Well, I've certainly had fun here, Wade. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure and an honor, and thank you. Keep up the great work and the ministry that you're doing, and it really has been an honor. We'll be in touch. I also, for the audience, I think a lot of them subscribe, but I'll be reflecting on this tomorrow and writing an article on my Substack about what I learned from this interaction. And David, I'll get that over to you as well. So with that, we have just one more thing to do, and that's air the sneak peek for next week's show. And everyone, thank you so much for being here tonight, and David, especially you. Hey, everyone, it's Wade Franson back in the studio with an amazing guest for this coming Tuesday's show at 8 p.m. Central Time on Created in the Image of God on November 4th. I'm here with Brian Zahnd. And after all, it's the political season, not this year, but, it's kind of that election fall feeling in the air. Brian, among many other things, aside from building a very large church that was very successful, pastoring it for 40 some years, and has written a number of books, including one called Postcards from Babylon. And we're here to talk about the role of religion in society and Brian's take on the early church, Emperor Constantine, and many other things. Welcome to the studio, Brian.
Thank you, Wade. Good to be with you.
Well, I'm going to open up with a real fun softball. You said one time that you wrote Bob Dylan on a ballot for president. What's your favorite Bob Dylan song?
Oh my goodness. I can't tell you the favorite song. I'll give you a favorite album. My favorite album is Blood on the Tracks. But I also like Blonde on Blonde, but I also like Time Out of Mind, but I also like Highway 61 Revisited, etc. So I can just give you a favorite album. That's the one that starts off with Tangled Up in Blue. That's the opening track on Blood on the Tracks, Tangled Up in Blue.
My absolute favorite album. And where do you want this killing done?
You can do it out on Highway. Let me give you the whole thing. God said to Abraham, "Kill me a son." Abe said, "Man, you must be putting me on." God said, "No." Abe said, "What?" God said, "You can do what you want, Abe, but next time you see me coming, you better run." Abe said to God, "Where you want this killing done?" God said, "You can do it out on Highway 61.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Bob Dylan is amazing,
Yeah.
I don't think he would want to be president. I don't know if he'd make a good president, but I can see why you voted for him.
Yeah, I voted for him.
All right. So Bob, Brian, so weaving in all of your, and the names of your books, the titles of your books, I mean, you have so much wisdom, history, experience, but also you kind of weave in things like that to reach people. What is it about that with you?
Well, I'm greatly influenced by the arts. And I'm not necessarily weaving those in to make a point or to attract people. It's just how my mind works. In fact, my most recent book is called The Wood Between the Worlds, A Poetic Theology of the Cross. And it's because even though I can write theological prose, and I do, I don't limit myself to that medium. In other words, I think the truth of God can be communicated just as well through painting, song, poem, literature, art, film, as through more conventional theological prose. So that's how I roll with that.
The love of God is not of this world; it's completely of the soul, right? I'm inspired by what I'm hearing from you, and the audience is going to be inspired when we have a full hour to unpack the many aspects of what you've learned over the years. So to the audience, this is one show you're not going to want to miss. Please be there at 8 p.m. sharp on November 4th for Created in the Image, 8 p.m. Central for Created in the Image of God with Bob Zand. We'll see you there.